Hey there, folks. I'm in San Francisco in the Tenderloin, where I'm reviewing this book, Sue Grafton, O is for Outlaw. Look at these murals here. It's wild. You know, the reason I came here is because I began my journalism career kind of in the Tenderloin many years ago. I was writing for this small newspaper in the Tenderloin. It was published in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Cambodian, I think it was. Tenderloin Times. That's kind of where I first wrote a story, you know. And from there I went and I became a crime reporter after that, a few years later, at the Stockton Record. I had heard that Stockton was this great news town, and I wanted to be in a place that had great stories that I could cover. So I wrote to them, and all of a sudden they get back to me, hey, we got a crime reporting job open. And it turned out what had happened was, it's kind of delicate, but, you know. Anyway, the reason they had an opening was because the guy who had the job before me had a serious cocaine problem and was a flasher, went around to the high schools flashing girls. Literally, they called him the Mad Whacker at one of the high schools. Sad story, not gonna mention his name. He went to prison. He was literally arrested by the same cops where he would go to report. He'd drop by the office of the sheriff and the cops, and they go, hey, anything new? And they'd be like, no, until they arrested him. He did 5 years in prison, and I hope he's doing very well. I'm not gonna mention his name, as I said. But so I got that job, and I've been working at the Orange County Register, and I was about to head off. My dad said, you know, Sam, are you really sure you want that job? We are not the most streetwise family, and which was true. My dad was a literature professor, right? And my mom was an elementary school teacher. She died long before that, but he was right. He was 100% right. But I thought it would be a cool job. I also wanted to learn to write. That's what happened in Stockton. I learned to write. I wrote 4 or 5 stories a day, literally a day. I would write those stories. Unbelievable. And I covered like 200 murders. I covered a drug bust. I wrote a long thing about the prostitute stroll in Stockton, Wilson Way, with all the motels and everything. This was like 1988. I was there for 4 years. Gangs, prostitution, drug trafficking, the whole bit. I learned so much. And it was the best job I could ever have. I wrote like a fiend. When you do that for years, man, at the end, you are like really ready. I would write a crime log every day. And this was like in agate. It was just like brief mention that at such and such an address, the burglary suspect was taken into custody, and boom, that's it. It's like, and then put the guy's name. If he was arrested, put the guy's name in there, right? And it would be 5 to 8 little things that happened the Stockton police had. So one day I get a call from a guy who says, hey, you write the crime log? Yeah. And you didn't put my brother in the crime log. And I'm like, yeah, okay. Why would he want his name in the crime log? Because he was in jail, the brother told me. And they all read my crime log every day in jail. And when they didn't see his name, they thought he was a snitch. So I said, oh, wow, okay. So I went by the cops again the next day and talked to the burglary detective. And sure enough, this guy had been arrested for burglary. And I put him in the next day in the crime log. And I hope he didn't get beaten up. Really, since then, I've thought of myself as a crime reporter. And never stopped. And in fact, a lot of what I've written has been, like Dreamland, The Least of Us. These are books about, kind of true crime in a sense. I used to read detective fiction all the time. Well, a lot, And when I started writing as a journalist, first in the Tenderloin, some other jobs in between, then I went to Stockton, I just stopped. I stopped reading detective pulp fiction. It was too hollow It was too easy, and I began as a crime reporter. I began to see that what I was covering was so difficult to understand. Whereas with detective fiction, you know, kind of the detective kind of figures it all out, and you kind of tie it all up at the end. But I remember feeling like that's not really how things worked, or I began to learn that that's really not how things worked. You know, that it was really kind of a whole different scene, and that's frequently you just didn't know. You really just didn't know the whole story. Sometimes the whole story is so difficult, and people lying all the time, and people not even knowing themselves what the story was. And as a journalist, you know, I came to have a real, I guess, respect for the idea that you can't really know a lot of stuff. I remember talking with a detective, a narcotics officer in Ohio, and it was about a case that actually was really kind of cut and dry. But he said, you know, so many of our cases, we don't really have a clue what's going on. All of it, we just don't understand the whole story. We're dealing in shards of knowledge, you know. And you know, detective fiction is based on the idea that you can know things, that you can figure it all out at the end. Fantasy, I knew all along it was fantasy, but it just seemed unsatisfyingly unreal, I guess. So the other day I was at my Goodwill outlet, and amid all the self-help books comes this book here. O is for Outlaw. Sue Grafton, veteran detective novelist, now passed away, but wrote all these books, you know, the alphabet books. A is for something, and B is for something else, etc. You know, I had a lot of respect for her because she was a writer. Every day she wrote. Proof was that by the time she died, she had gotten up to S. That's how many novels she wrote. But that's how you become a writer. You just sit and write, you know, with a deadline, with an idea, presumably, you know. So I thought reading the book would give me an opportunity to talk about my own career, things that I think are interesting about crime reporting and writing, and about writing in general. After all, these book reviews are not me telling you whether the book's any good, like a class. Whatever ideas it prods in me, that's kind of what I'll put into these book reviews, you know. And so I read Sue Grafton's O is for Outlaw, not with an idea of thinking, okay, I'm going to analyze the whole book, simply as a way of saying, yeah, let me talk a little bit about what I think is really cool, which is crime reporting and the hazy nature of human motivation that you have to deal with if you're a crime reporter, and you have to be very, very aware of. So I figured, okay, I always kind of admire writers like that, even though I may not always like their books. And I decided to read O is for Outlaw. All due respect to Ms. Grafton, I couldn't finish it. It just didn't work for me. Kind of dry. I will say though, for new writers, one thing I do a lot of is I take books like that, other books too, all kinds of things, and I read the first 2 or 3 pages. I'm always interested in how writers begin what they're doing, whatever they're writing. How do you start? The lead is so important. I always believe, and so there are many times when I'll just take a book and read the first 2 pages, maybe in the library, maybe at a thrift store, whatever, and read the first 2 pages, 3 pages. You know, one of the great beginnings of all time in the movies is the movie The Verdict with Paul Newman. Sidney Lumet did that movie. And fascinating. It's about an alcoholic ambulance chasing lawyer and a big case he gets. And I'll let you watch it. It's a fantastic movie. I watched it like 6-7 times. And by the time the credits are finished rolling at the beginning of the movie, he's already showed you everything you need to know about that ambulance chasing lawyer's life. He's alcoholic, he's got no pride, all these guys. Just watch the first 2 or 3 minutes of that movie and you will get this totally clear idea of who the Paul Newman character is. And that is the foundation of the rest of the movie. It's just a fascinating thing. And so I do that with detective novels a lot too. You know, or whatever book I find, I just read the beginning 2 or 3 pages. I did that with this and figured, okay, I'll give it a shot, you know, even though I knew that this wasn't really my cup of tea, but I figured why not? Always for Outlaw. It didn't work for me, but I do admire the discipline of a writer like Sue Grafton. One of the things that always struck me about crime reporting too was how grimy most crime is. It deals with like people who are just so desperate and making all the wrong choices and having just beaten lives, you know. So often that's the case. Last time I was here was in 2023, and right around here, I can't remember exactly which street it was now, no, several streets, they had all these Honduran guys selling fentanyl. Now, Hondurans, I knew all about them because I was going to write a couple of chapters about them in my Dreamland book. The Hondurans have this business model, very much like the Jalisco boys from Nayarit that I wrote about in Dreamland, have their business model for selling black tar heroin like pizza. The Hondurans had their business model that was selling heroin on foot, hand-to-hand sales on foot, usually in city centers like Denver, Salt Lake, Portland, San Francisco. They've been doing this for years. This is not new. This has been going on for years. Well, when fentanyl came along, they stopped doing heroin. They started selling fentanyl, and you saw these guys, covens of these guys, big thick groups of them, all with hoodies and masks because of COVID, so to speak, and all they were doing was selling fentanyl. It was deadly as hell. It was awful. It was awful to look at. It was awful that the city allowed that to happen because it didn't need to happen. I have not seen them. I'm not sure where they are. I think the city went through a purge of people with this kind of like idea, like we should never arrest anybody for selling drugs, which is such nonsense, particularly when it comes to like fentanyl, you know? You got to get that crap. You got to get those people. You got to have consequences, seems to me. And these guys had none. These guys had none. They were just doing their thing, you know. And throwing bottles. I filmed them. They started throwing bottles at me and this kind of thing. I'm like, you know. Anyway, I don't see the Hondurans out here. I do see some people who look like they're in the grips of fentanyl addiction, but the Hondurans, maybe they moved from the areas I knew, but they're not here now. And so I think that's a good thing because the city was tallying horrible numbers of deaths due to fentanyl. And people were coming from all over Northern California to the Tenderloin to buy their fentanyl from these guys. Now they're gone, or at least they seem like they're gone. I don't really know. Others will tell me what the real story is. I'm going to take Sue Grafton's book, throw it back into the mix at the Goodwill outlet where I go, and hope it has a new life. I do admire what she accomplished in her career, though. I'm not keen on her books, but you know what? She was a writer, and writers have to think of themselves as craftspeople, right? You write. Inspiration will come, but it's overrated. What is necessary is to sit down and write. Put the internet on hold, put everything to a side and write. It's like a job. You sit down and you do it. And don't think of yourself as bereft of inspiration. These kids, 18-year-old guys, who bust into a poker card room in Stockton. And the one guy was kind of the leader, a guy named Dean, 18-year-old kid, comes in with a big gun, and the security guard, African-American guy, shoots down this kid as soon as he gets in. He sees him coming, and the kid doesn't take like 3 or 4 steps before he's shot and killed. I went to the kid's house to talk to his folks. They opened the door, asked who I was, and they shut it. So I never figured out what the deal was with Dean or who his compatriots were, because they fled as soon as they heard gunshots. Anyway, he died right there at the card room, shot by this security guard named Eddie. And I wrote it up, and that was about it. Everybody wanted to call Eddie a hero, and the card room owner was always such a heroic guy, this kind of thing. Eddie lived the rest of his life in deep, deep regret for having killed that kid. He was a Christian man, apparently took the Ten Commandments seriously, even though he was completely in the right, and it took no time at all for the DA to consider it to be self-defense, defense of others, but he never got over the fact that he had taken another life. And I know this because I met a guy who was either his psychiatrist or the psychiatrist who knew the psychiatrist for Eddie. And he told me, yeah, this guy's been in therapy ever since. It has been very, very difficult. And every time there's a police shooting, I think about Eddie. Because the idea is frequently, oh yeah, these cops just love to kill people. I don't know any cops like that. I have never met any cops like that. There may have been some, I'm sure there are, a lot of human beings involved. But many cops live with deep, deep remorse, regret, at having to do that, even though what they did was probably save lives. Who knows what would have happened had Dean and his buddies come in there and without any buddy to defend the card room. They've been in there for a long time, and who knows how many people might have died otherwise. These are the kinds of stories that I would write as a crime reporter, I would encounter as a crime reporter, that I never really found in detective fiction. It was never like this, hazy and gray and all kinds of murky motives, or not just murky motives, but conflicting motives. Obviously, this guy had to do his job. He did it, and yet he lived with it for the rest of his life, this regret, at having killed this young boy who acted like a fool, come into a card room with a gun. That's what the kind of story truly grew to, if not like love in some sense, to really find fascinating and understand that was true journalism, I never actually did write Eddie's story because it was a private thing, and I didn't want to go busting into his therapy or asking psychiatrists and that kind of thing. And besides, the guy who actually was treating him probably, would have said, no, I don't know what you're talking about, or I have no comment, whatever. Fine, what you should have done. But I just it always struck me that these were the kinds of stories I was dealing with. Stories that were not easy, not wrapped up with a bow at the end, right? Not everybody saying, oh, what a hero Eddie was. Everybody did say that. Eddie didn't think so. Eddie didn't think so. What a job, man. Being a journalist, it's such a powerful job. I love it so much.